Ma'am, this section is for premium clients. Emily Whitmore didn't even try to hide the impatience in her voice. Her eyes moved slowly over the black woman standing in front of the counter, pausing on the tailored blazer, then her natural textured hair, then her calm, unreadable expression. Emily let out a small breath through her nose, almost a laugh. "You may feel more comfortable using the standard service desks," she added, gesturing vaguely toward the crowded line near the entrance. Without waiting for an answer, she adjusted the nameplate on her desk, as if restoring order. A colleague leaned closer behind her and whispered something under her breath. Emily's lips curved slightly. "Well, large financial requests usually require a verifiable history," she continued, sliding a clipboard across the marble surface, but stopping it just short of Aaliyah's reach. Her fingers tapped lightly against the counter. Tap, tap, especially when they appear unexpected. A customer nearby lowered his newspaper just enough to watch. Another subtly lifted a phone. Emily tilted her head. "We just want to make sure everything is legitimate." The word hung in the air longer than necessary. Aaliyah did not respond. She did not argue. She did not move. She simply checked the time. 13 a.m. 7 minutes later. The same room filled with quiet judgment would struggle to find a single word to say. If you believe respect should never depend on assumptions, stay with this story until the end. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Aaliyah Carter had long ago learned that silence could be louder than defense. At 34 years old, she had mastered the discipline of stillness, the quiet restraint that unsettled people who expected explanation, apology, or reaction. Standing inside the polished lobby of Hawthorne National Bank's downtown Chicago branch, she carried herself with the same calm precision she brought into every negotiation room board meeting and investment review she had attended for the past decade. Her dark brown skin glowed softly beneath the overhead lighting, her natural shoulder-length curls framing a composed face that revealed nothing of the irritation pressing quietly behind her steady gaze. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer over an ivory silk blouse, the fabric sitting perfectly against her posture. The trousers were structured but elegant, the lines clean, deliberate. Everything about her appearance suggested discipline rather than display. Nothing about her invited doubt, yet doubt had found her anyway. Aaliyah had arrived at 10:02 a.m. for a scheduled document review that should have taken no more than 15 minutes. The appointment confirmation sat in her email inbox, verified twice by the private banking department's administrative coordinator the previous afternoon. The meeting involved a compliance update tied to a strategic capital allocation connected to a multi-state development initiative. The amount involved was precise $480 million. Not her first negotiation at that level, not even her largest. But today's visit carried personal significance. Hawthorne National Bank had once been an institution her father had trusted, a place where he deposited modest paychecks earned through decades of disciplined work as a maintenance supervisor at a public hospital. He had believed in the idea of stability. He had believed in institutions. He had believed perhaps too strongly that professionalism guaranteed fairness. Aaliyah had learned differently. She grew up in the South Shore neighborhood of Chicago, in a brick apartment building where the elevators occasionally stalled between floors, and the winter wind pressed through the hallway windows like an unwelcome visitor. Her mother, Denise Carter, worked 12-hour shifts as a registered nurse. Her father, Leonard Carter, rose before sunrise each day and returned home with tired shoulders and quiet dignity. Neither complained. Both expected excellence. Aaliyah learned early that excellence alone did not always earn equal treatment. In high school, she had been mistaken for administrative staff while attending an academic competition at Northwestern University. At 22, during an internship at a financial consulting firm, A client once asked if she was part of the diversity program. At 28, after presenting a risk mitigation model that later saved a mid-sized manufacturing company nearly $8 million, a senior executive complimented her articulation with visible surprise. Each moment had taught her the same lesson: competence often needed proof twice. Confidence required patience. Dignity required endurance. She never allowed bitterness to settle. She invested instead. Numbers made sense when people did not. Markets responded to logic even when bias clouded judgment. By 30, she had built a reputation among private equity circles as a strategist capable of identifying undervalued infrastructure assets before they entered mainstream attention. Her portfolio quietly expanded through partnerships structured with precision and discretion. She did not seek publicity. She preferred influence without noise. Her investment firm, Carter Global Holdings, remained intentionally discreet, its presence known primarily among institutional partners rather than public media. She believed visibility often distorted perception. Today's meeting represented a continuation of a 3-year strategic relationship with Hawthorne National Bank. 3 years earlier, the institution had faced a liquidity strain caused by overexposure to volatile commercial real estate assets. Several analysts predicted contraction. Aaliyah saw opportunity. Through a carefully structured capital stabilization instrument, she facilitated access to funds that allowed the bank to maintain operational continuity while restructuring its risk profile. The agreement contained confidentiality clauses typical of private investment negotiations. Few employees within the retail branch network would recognize her name. Fewer would understand her authority. She preferred it that way. At 10:06 a.m., she had approached the reception desk and introduced herself calmly. "Good morning. I have a scheduled appointment with private banking." Emily Whitmore had looked up slowly. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Professional politeness remained, but warmth did not follow. "Name." Emily asked, fingers hovering above the keyboard. "Aaliyah Carter." The typing paused briefly. Emily glanced once at the screen, then again at Aaliyah. "Do you have documentation regarding the nature of your request?" The wording struck Aaliyah as unusual. Appointments typically required only confirmation. Still, she provided the reference number. Emily accepted the information but did not immediately proceed. Instead, she asked additional questions unrelated to the appointment structure. "How long have you held this account? Who referred you to private banking services? Are you depositing or withdrawing funds today?" Each question delivered with measured neutrality. Each question slightly outside normal protocol. Aaliyah answered concisely, without irritation, without challenge. Patience often revealed more than confrontation. Behind Emily, the muted murmur of keyboards and printer activity continued. A digital display board announced ticket numbers in a soft chime sequence. The scent of polished wood and faint citrus cleaning solution lingered in the air. Normal surroundings. Subtle tension. Aaliyah noticed the way Emily's posture remained partially angled, not fully engaged, not fully welcoming. A barrier invisible, yet present. At 10:10 a.m., Emily requested secondary identification. At 10:11 a.m., she requested confirmation of account origin. At 10:12 a.m., she requested verification of transaction purpose. The pattern formed clearly. Delay disguised as procedure. Scrutiny disguised as policy. Still, Aaliyah did not react. She had seen hesitation before. She had seen doubt before. She had seen assumptions attempt to disguise themselves as professionalism. She rested her hands calmly on the leather portfolio she carried, the material worn just enough to signal use rather than display. Inside that portfolio sat documents capable of influencing the strategic direction of the bank itself. Yet, in that moment. None of that authority changed the expression behind the counter. Emily looked again at the screen, then at Aaliyah. Something unspoken remained suspended between them. The clock behind the reception desk changed to 10:13 a.m. Aaliyah noticed and waited, because experience had taught her something simple. Revelation rarely needed assistance. Sometimes truth preferred timing, and timing, she suspected, was already moving toward her at 10:13 a.m. The quiet tension inside Hawthorne National Bank no longer felt subtle. It felt intentional. Emily Whitmore's fingers hovered above the keyboard without typing. Her posture remained upright professional, but her eyes continued returning to Aaliyah Carter with a cautious hesitation that no longer disguised itself as routine verification. The air carried the faint, mechanical hum of recessed lighting, yet the stillness between them felt heavier than silence. "I'm just going to need one more confirmation," Emily said, her tone balanced carefully between politeness and doubt. Aaliyah nodded once. "Of course." The response was calm, measured, unprovoking. Emily clicked through several internal system screens, her brow tightening slightly, as though searching for a reason to justify the delay she had already created. Behind her, a younger teller briefly glanced toward the interaction before quickly returning to her own terminal. The subtle awareness of tension had begun to spread. "Can you clarify the purpose of today's visit?" Emily continued. "The appointment confirmation includes that information," Aaliyah replied evenly. "Yes," Emily said, tilting her head slightly, "but I'd prefer to hear it directly." The phrasing was small, but deliberate. Aaliyah noticed the shift from procedure to personal scrutiny. "I am here to review documentation connected to an existing capital allocation agreement," she said. Emily's fingers paused again. "Capital allocation," she repeated softly, as if testing the words for authenticity. Her eyes moved briefly across Aaliyah's blazer, then to the portfolio resting on the counter, then to the watch at her wrist. A simple watch. Elegant, but not ostentatious. Understated confidence often unsettled those expecting visible signals of wealth. "I see," Emily replied, though the words suggested she did not. A man standing 2 places behind Aaliyah in line shifted his weight audibly. The leather sole of his shoe scraped lightly against the marble floor. He leaned slightly sideways, attempting not to appear interested while remaining fully attentive. Another customer adjusted her handbag strap more slowly than necessary. Curiosity had begun to circulate. Emily opened a drawer beneath her workstation and removed a printed verification form typically reserved for accounts flagged for irregular activity. The document was rarely required for scheduled private banking consultations. She placed the paper gently on the counter, but not directly in front of Aaliyah. Off to the side. An invitation without welcome. "I'll need this completed before we proceed," Emily said. Aaliyah looked down at the document briefly, then back at Emily. "Is there a reason this is necessary?" she asked. Emily offered a small smile, professionally, neutral, carefully restrained. "It's simply a precaution." The word precaution hovered in the air longer than needed. Precautions were rarely neutral in practice. They often reflected perception rather than policy. Aaliyah picked up the form without comment, scanning the sections with efficient precision. Her eyes moved steadily across the lines requesting transaction history, clarification, employment verification, asset origin description, and anticipated transfer scale. Questions that would normally appear only when opening new accounts exceeding regulatory thresholds. Her account had existed for 3 years. The internal system would already contain this information. Emily watched closely as Aaliyah read. The observation was not hidden. Behind the reception desk, the younger teller's typing slowed again. The rhythm of keystrokes became inconsistent attention divided between responsibility and curiosity. Aaliyah completed the form within 90 seconds. Clear handwriting, precise wording, no hesitation. She returned the clipboard calmly. Emily accepted it and reviewed the entries slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she reached the section referencing institutional partnership structures. Carter Global Holdings. Emily read aloud the unfamiliar name sounding uncertain on her tongue. Yes, Aaliyah replied. Emily nodded once, though her expression suggested no recognition. And your role within the organization. I oversee strategic allocation partnerships. Emily blinked once, then again. She typed the company name into the internal search system, her fingers moving slightly faster now. The screen displayed limited retail-level visibility information due to the confidentiality tier assigned to institutional accounts. Restricted access. Another small barrier. Emily's jaw shifted subtly. I may need to confirm this with branch management, she said. Aaliyah inclined her head once. Take the time you need. Patience again. Composure again. No resistance offered. Yet the longer the delay continued, the more visible the imbalance became. A customer near the waiting area pretended to read a financial magazine upside down. Another subtly activated the camera function on a smartphone. The environment had begun to transform from routine banking morning into quiet observation theater. Emily rose from her chair. I'll be back shortly, she said. The phrase suggested efficiency. The pace suggested hesitation. She walked toward the glass-partitioned offices located behind the main reception area, her heels producing soft, measured clicks against the polished floor. As she passed the assistant desk, she leaned slightly toward a colleague and whispered something inaudible. The colleague's eyebrows lifted. Surprise, doubt, curiosity, all spreading quietly. Aaliyah remained standing, hands resting lightly on her portfolio, eyes steady, breathing even. At 10:14 a.m., the digital wall clock shifted forward by 1 minute. 4 customers now openly watched. No one spoke directly. Social caution often prevented intervention when uncertainty carried authority. Emily entered the office of Daniel Harper, branch manager. Through the glass partition, silhouettes moved. A short exchange. Daniel's posture straightened. He glanced toward the reception area. His eyes landed on Aaliyah. His expression changed. Not recognition. Assessment. He adjusted his tie. Picked up a tablet. Walked toward the lobby. Emily followed 1 step behind him. Momentum had shifted. The subtle hesitation had become formal scrutiny. And scrutiny once formalized often carried consequences. Daniel approached the counter with controlled composure, offering a professional smile that did not fully reach his eyes. Good morning, he said calmly. I understand there are some questions regarding documentation. The word questions sounded neutral, but the atmosphere surrounding it did not. Aaliyah met his gaze steadily. Yes, she said simply. Daniel glanced briefly at the completed form, then back at her. We just need to ensure everything aligns appropriately with internal compliance standards. Appropriate, aligned, standards. Language often softened accusation, but tone revealed intention. The lobby grew quieter. Expectation now replaced curiosity. Aaliyah noticed the reflection of several observers in the polished chrome panel beside the counter. Witnesses without involvement. Judgment without context. Daniel's eyes moved briefly across the portfolio. Then the watch. Then the calm stillness he could not easily interpret. Something in the room had begun leaning toward confrontation, and yet Aaliyah did not move, did not argue, did not defend, because experience had taught her something simple. Moments like this often revealed more about others than about herself. And whatever came next would reveal everything Daniel Harper had built his career on reading risk. Numbers, behaviors, inconsistencies. Small deviations often signaled larger problems. In 22 years working in retail banking compliance, he had learned that caution preserved reputation, and reputation preserved stability. Institutions like Hawthorne National Bank did not survive market volatility by ignoring warning signs. Yet what Daniel believed he saw standing before him was not a clear warning sign. It was uncertainty wrapped in composure, and uncertainty in his experience justified scrutiny. He placed both hands lightly on the marble counter, maintaining a measured distance that allowed authority without overt confrontation. His tailored navy suit fit precisely, projecting control and reliability. The branch manager's office behind him, visible through the glass panels, reflected muted sunlight across the polished floor. "Ms. Carter," Daniel began, glancing once more at the verification form. "There appears to be a discrepancy between the scale of the transaction referenced in your appointment request and the information immediately accessible within our retail system interface." His tone remained even. Professional, but deliberate enough to be heard by those nearby. Aaliyah did not shift her posture. "I scheduled the appointment through the private banking coordination office," she replied calmly. "Yes." Daniel acknowledged, scrolling through the tablet in his hands. However, certain authorizations typically require pre-clearance flags within our branch-level visibility systems. The phrasing sounded technical, almost procedural, yet the implication lingered clearly in the air. Something did not belong. Emily stood slightly behind Daniel, her expression attentive but restrained. She held the completed form as though it represented validation of her initial hesitation. Several customers now pretended less convincingly to ignore the exchange. The older man near the waiting chairs lowered his reading glasses to observe directly. A young woman seated beside the window paused her phone conversation, her attention visibly divided. Public scrutiny often intensified private judgment. Daniel turned the tablet screen slightly toward Emily, lowering his voice just enough to suggest discretion while still allowing fragments of the conversation to remain audible. "I'm not seeing confirmation of institutional authorization coding," he said quietly. Emily nodded, her lips tightening. "That's what concerned me." "Concern." The word traveled quickly through the listening silence. Aaliyah observed the exchange without interruption. Patience remained her ally. Daniel turned his attention back toward her. "Could you clarify the nature of Carter Global Holdings' relationship with Hawthorne National Bank?" The question sounded reasonable, but the delivery suggested doubt already formed. "Our relationship is documented through structured capital allocation agreements established 3 years ago," Aaliyah answered. Daniel's eyes moved carefully across her face, searching for signals that might confirm or contradict his assumption. "And your role personally authorizes movements at this scale?" he asked. "Yes." The single word landed without emphasis. Confidence rarely required decoration. Daniel inhaled slowly. "In situations involving significant financial activity, we are obligated to verify origin and authority to ensure protection of all parties involved." Protection. A word often used to justify exclusion. Behind Daniel, one of the assistant tellers shifted papers unnecessarily loudly, creating the subtle impression that routine work continued unaffected. Yet attention remained fixed. Emily folded her arms lightly, her posture projecting validation rather than neutrality. "Large financial movements sometimes attract fraudulent representation attempts," she added carefully. Fraudulent representation. The phrase introduced a new layer. The air tightened slightly. Aaliyah met Emily's gaze briefly. Unblinking. Unprovoked. Then returned her attention to Daniel. "If additional verification is required, I am prepared to provide what is necessary," she said evenly. Daniel nodded once. Documentation of source authority would be appropriate. Aaliyah opened her leather portfolio, slowly removing a sealed folder containing confirmation letters issued by the Institutional Partnership Office, each page printed on watermarked stock, each signature authenticated, each clause structured through legal precision. She placed the folder gently on the counter. Daniel reviewed the documents carefully. One page, then another. His brow shifted slightly as he encountered authorization identifiers not typically visible within branch-level documentation, restricted access categories. Emily leaned subtly closer, attempting to interpret the coded references. Daniel reached the final page and paused, then returned to the first. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This documentation references executive-level authorization," he said slowly. "That is correct," Aaliyah replied, "and the total allocation referenced here is—" He stopped reading aloud. The number remained visible. $480 million US. A figure rarely encountered within routine branch operations. Even within major metropolitan institutions, transactions of that magnitude were handled through specialized channels. Daniel cleared his throat quietly. "These materials appear to correspond with institutional investment activity," he said carefully. "Yes." Emily's expression flickered momentarily between doubt and uncertainty. "But there is no notation within our branch-level system indicating executive appointment priority," she said. Priority. The absence of immediate recognition strengthened her assumption rather than weakening it. Daniel tapped the edge of the folder lightly. "Ms. Carter, please understand that until authorization pathways are fully verified, we must proceed cautiously. Caution again. Always framed as policy, never as perception." Aaliyah inclined her head slightly. "I understand procedural diligence," she said. Her voice remained calm, unhurried, steady. Daniel exchanged a brief glance with Emily. A silent communication formed, the type shaped by hierarchy and confirmation bias. "I'm going to request involvement from internal security liaison staff to ensure compliance alignment," Daniel said. The words were carefully chosen, but the message was unmistakable. Security. The assistant teller near the window looked up fully now. The young woman who had paused her phone conversation lowered it completely. The older man folded his newspaper. Anticipation had replaced curiosity. Aaliyah remained composed. No visible frustration, no defensive tone, only patience. Experience had prepared her for moments where perception moved faster than truth. Daniel pressed a discreet call button beneath the counter. Within seconds, a subtle signal illuminated at the security desk positioned near the building entrance. Two uniformed personnel glanced toward the reception area. Professional posture, neutral expression. Yet their movement signaled escalation. Emily exhaled softly, as though reassured by the reinforcement of her concern. Daniel maintained eye contact with Aaliyah. "This step allows us to complete verification efficiently," he said. Efficiently. Yet the room now felt slower than ever. Aaliyah noticed the reflection of observers multiplying across the polished surfaces. Witnesses drawn by uncertainty. Uncertainty shaped by assumption. Assumption shaped by something deeper than policy. The security personnel began walking toward the counter. Measured pace. Calm demeanor. Yet the symbolic shift was unmistakable. Authority had entered the scene. And once authority entered publicly, consequences rarely remained contained. Still, Aaliyah did not react, because she knew something Daniel did not yet know. Timing. And timing, she suspected, was almost ready. The presence of security changed the temperature of the room. Not physically, the air conditioning still whispered through hidden vents, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and citrus cleanser, but psychologically. The moment the two uniformed officers stepped away from their post near the glass entrance and began walking toward the reception counter, the quiet uncertainty inside Hawthorne National Bank transformed into something more visible, something heavier. Authority once visible rarely went unnoticed. Officer Grant Miller was the first to arrive beside Daniel Harper. His posture was composed, his expression neutral in the practiced way of someone trained to observe before acting. Beside him stood Officer Raymond Collins, slightly taller, his hands clasped lightly in front of him in a posture that suggested patience, but also readiness. Customers shifted subtly to gain a clearer view. Curiosity rarely required invitation. Daniel offered the officers a brief nod of acknowledgement before speaking in a voice just controlled enough to appear procedural. "We're simply completing a verification review," he said. Simple words. Complicated implications. Officer Miller looked toward Aaliyah, briefly offering a polite but restrained nod. "Ma'am," he said calmly. Aaliyah returned the nod. "Good morning." Her voice remained even, measured, unintimidated. Emily stood slightly behind Daniel now, her earlier uncertainty replaced by something closer to validation. The presence of security had in her mind confirmed that her instinct to question had been justified. "This is a standard protocol situation," she said, almost as if narrating for the benefit of those listening nearby. Standard protocol. The phrase landed gently, but echoed loudly. Daniel cleared his throat once. "Ms. Carter, until we confirm institutional authorization through internal channels, we are obligated to temporarily pause transaction review." Pause. Delay given official language. "I understand procedural timelines," Aaliyah replied calmly. Officer Collins glanced briefly toward the open portfolio resting on the marble counter. The documents remained visible, formal, structured, unmistakably legitimate to a trained financial eye. Yet doubt persisted. Emily crossed her arms lightly. "There have been instances where individuals misrepresent affiliations to gain access to high-value accounts," she said, her voice lowered slightly but still audible. Misrepresent affiliations. The suggestion had become more explicit. The older man seated near the waiting chairs leaned forward slightly, interest overcoming discretion. A young professional in a gray suit checked his phone camera angle subtly. No one intervened. Public discomfort often chose observation over involvement. Daniel spoke again, maintaining the careful balance between politeness and implied suspicion. "For clarity, the magnitude of the allocation referenced in these materials exceeds typical retail branch engagement thresholds." Aaliyah listened without interruption. "In such cases, additional authentication pathways are necessary." Authentication. Another word that sounded neutral, yet felt targeted. Officer Miller shifted his stance slightly, positioning himself with a respectful but unmistakable presence near Aaliyah's right side. Not touching, not instructing, but clearly involved. Emily's eyes moved once more across Aaliyah's blazer, her watch, her posture, as though still searching for confirmation that her assumptions aligned with visible evidence. Confidence without display often unsettled expectation. "Would you be able to provide confirmation from an executive contact directly?" Daniel asked. "I can," Aaliyah said. Her tone remained steady. "I anticipated that possibility." Emily's eyebrows lifted briefly. Anticipated. Confidence often complicated bias. Aaliyah reached calmly into her portfolio and removed a slim card holder, extracting a simple black business card printed with minimal text. "Carter Global Holdings, Executive Authorization Liaison, Direct Contact Line." Daniel accepted the card carefully. His eyes scanned the information, then scanned again. He typed the number into the internal verification system. Processing. Restricted network. Delayed access. Another barrier. Another moment of hesitation. "I will attempt to confirm through our executive coordination directory," Daniel said. The word sounded procedural, yet uncertainty lingered. Emily leaned slightly closer. "We have experienced cases where unauthorized representatives present convincing materials," she added quietly. "Convincing materials." The phrase landed more sharply this time. Aaliyah did not react. Officer Collins shifted his weight, subtly maintaining a respectful distance while remaining observant. The quiet hum of the digital cue system sounded again. "Ticket number A113. No one moved. The atmosphere had shifted entirely toward this single interaction. A woman seated near the entrance whispered something softly to her companion. The companion nodded, eyes still fixed on the scene unfolding. Emily tapped her pen lightly against the counter. Tap, tap, tap. The rhythm suggested impatience rather than process. Daniel's tablet displayed limited confirmation pathways due to clearance tier restrictions. Information existed, but not at his level. He exhaled slowly. "In the absence of immediate confirmation, we must proceed conservatively," he said. Conservatively. The word often masked assumption. Emily spoke again. "It would be helpful if we could clarify the origin of the funds referenced." Clarify. Origin. Words carrying weight beyond policy. Aaliyah met her gaze briefly, then answered calmly. "The origin has been fully disclosed through institutional compliance review during initial partnership structuring." Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes, but for branch-level documentation, we must ensure consistency." Consistency. A word often used when difference caused discomfort. Officer Miller's radio emitted a faint static burst before returning to silence. The small interruption seemed louder than it was. Emily's posture straightened. Daniel placed the folder gently back onto the counter. "For now, we will need to temporarily restrict progression of this transaction request." Restrict. Another escalation. The older man in the waiting area exchanged a look with the woman beside him. The young professional lowered his phone slightly, his interest now fully visible. Aaliyah remained composed, hands resting lightly on the portfolio, eyes steady. No visible frustration, no defensive language, only patience. Daniel hesitated briefly before continuing. "If necessary, we may ask that you step aside while verification is completed." Step aside. A softer phrase for removal. Emily nodded subtly. Agreement without discussion. Officer Collins shifted slightly closer. Still respectful. Still silent. Yet unmistakably positioned. Aaliyah glanced once toward the glass entrance. Morning light filtered through the panels, reflecting across the polished floor in soft geometric patterns. 16 a.m. Time continued moving, and with each passing minute, the assumptions inside the room grew more certain, more visible, more public. Daniel adjusted his tie once more. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. Cooperation. Expectation framed as courtesy. Still, Aaliyah did not react, because experience had taught her something essential. Moments of unjust certainty often collapsed without warning, and when they did, they rarely left reputations unchanged. The room continued watching, waiting, unaware that the shift already approaching would soon change everything they believed they understood. By 10:17 a.m., the atmosphere inside Hawthorne National Bank no longer resembled a routine financial consultation. It resembled containment. Daniel Harper maintained the posture of a professional safeguarding institutional procedure, yet the tightening of his jaw betrayed something deeper than policy adherence. Emily Whitmore stood beside him, her expression composed but unmistakably firm, as though the presence of security had transformed her earlier hesitation into certainty. Officer Grant Miller, and Officer Raymond Collins remained positioned with deliberate neutrality close enough to communicate involvement, distant enough to preserve the appearance of discretion. But discretion had already dissolved. Customers no longer pretended to ignore the situation. The older man in the waiting chairs had folded his newspaper completely, now holding it motionless in his lap. A young couple near the entrance whispered quietly, their voices low but urgent. A woman in a beige coat openly held her phone chest high, the camera lens angled with careful subtlety. Public observation had become undeniable. Daniel placed both palms lightly on the marble counter again, leaning forward just slightly. "Ms. Carter," he began carefully, "until executive verification pathways confirm the authority structure referenced in your documentation, we cannot permit further progression of the transaction request." The phrasing sounded technical, but the message was simple. "Stop," Emily added softly. "It would be most efficient if we temporarily relocate this discussion away from the main service area." Relocate. The word carried the softness of diplomacy, yet implied removal. Aaliyah's posture remained unchanged. She neither stepped back nor leaned forward. She simply listened. Officer Collins shifted slightly closer, maintaining respectful distance, but reinforcing the suggestion that compliance would be expected. Daniel continued. "Our priority is to ensure the safety and integrity of all client accounts." Safety, integrity, words chosen carefully. Words often used when justification needed structure. "I have provided all documentation requested," Aaliyah said calmly. Her voice carried no tremor, no edge, only clarity. Emily offered a restrained smile that did not conceal her doubt. Additional confirmation is often required in cases involving unusually large asset declarations. Unusually large. The phrase subtly reframed legitimacy as improbability. Aaliyah's eyes moved briefly toward the digital clock mounted above the customer service signage, 10:18 a.m. Time advanced steadily. Daniel nodded once toward Officer Miller. The gesture was small, but unmistakable. Officer Miller spoke gently. "Ma'am, we would appreciate your cooperation in stepping over here while we complete verification." He gestured toward a side consultation desk positioned several feet away from the main reception counter. Visible, but separate. A space often used when conversations required privacy or control. The subtle relocation signaled escalation. Emily gathered the folder containing Aaliyah's documents, holding it firmly, as though maintaining custody of evidence. Evidence. A word never spoken, yet quietly implied. Aaliyah stepped calmly toward the indicated desk. Her movements remained deliberate, unhurried, unintimidated. Officer Collins positioned himself slightly behind her, not obstructing but clearly present. The watching customers shifted subtly to maintain visibility. Observation had become expectation. Daniel joined them at the consultation desk, placing the tablet carefully on the surface. "I hope you understand that these procedures are not personal," he said. Not personal, a phrase often used when actions felt precisely that way. Emily stood at Daniel's right side, her pen tapping lightly once against the folder. Tap. Silence followed. Aaliyah rested her hands lightly on the leather portfolio now placed on the desk before her. The material bore the subtle creases of frequent professional use. Quiet authority. Unannounced influence. Still unrecognized. Daniel attempted the executive verification contact line again. Restricted routing. Delayed connection. He exhaled slowly. The authorization structure associated with Carter Global Holdings appears to exist within a confidentiality tier beyond branch-level visibility, he admitted. Admitted, yet not accepted. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "Which complicates independent confirmation," she said. Complicates. Another word shifting responsibility away from assumption. Officer Miller's radio emitted another brief static sound. Background noise within an increasingly quiet room. Aaliyah remained composed, unmoved. She had encountered moments like this before. Rooms where credentials required repetition. Rooms where composure became evidence. Rooms where patience revealed more than confrontation. Daniel adjusted the tablet screen brightness. Attempted another directory search. Minimal results. Restricted index. He looked up again. Without immediate confirmation, we must temporarily limit access privileges. Limit access. The phrase struck more directly now. Emily spoke again. In certain situations, financial misrepresentation can create liability exposure for the institution. Misrepresentation. Liability. The language had sharpened. Aaliyah met her gaze steadily. The documentation provided is complete. Her tone remained calm. Unwavering. Officer Collins shifted his stance subtly. The movement was small, but symbolic, authority positioning itself closer. The older man in the waiting area leaned toward the aisle for a clearer view. A young professional adjusted his tie, absent-mindedly eyes fixed on the unfolding exchange. Daniel spoke carefully. We will need to temporarily suspend interaction privileges until verification is completed through appropriate channels. Suspend. Another escalation. Emily nodded once in agreement. Officer Miller gestured gently toward the seating chair opposite the consultation desk. If you would please remain here momentarily, he said. Remain. The suggestion of restriction now clearer. Aaliyah sat calmly, back straight, hands resting lightly atop the portfolio, eyes steady, untroubled. Daniel reviewed the documents once more, his brow tightening as unfamiliar authorization codes continued appearing across the pages. Each code represented institutional partnership classification levels not typically encountered within retail branch management. Complex, layered, beyond his clearance tier. Emily's earlier certainty began shifting slightly toward unease. Still, she remained silent. The watching customers now stood openly attentive. Whispers moved softly across the lobby. Speculation-filled absence of knowledge. Aaliyah glanced once more toward the glass entrance. Sunlight reflected brightly against the polished floor. 10:19 a.m. 1 minute closer. Daniel closed the folder slowly. We appreciate your patience, he said. Patience. A word Aaliyah knew well, because patience often revealed truth, faster than argument. And something about the unfolding moment suggested the truth approaching would not arrive quietly. The security officers remained nearby. The observers continued watching. The assumptions remained unchallenged. For now. But the balance inside the room had begun shifting in ways none of them yet recognized. And when realization arrived, it would not ask permission. By 10:20 a.m., the quiet pressure inside Hawthorne National Bank had hardened into something unmistakable. Control. Daniel Harper stood beside the consultation desk with the practiced stillness of someone convinced that procedure justified escalation. Emily Whitmore remained close, holding the folder containing Aaliyah Carter's documentation, as though maintaining possession reinforced correctness. Officer Grant Miller and Officer Raymond Collins had not moved far, their calm presence now functioning less as reassurance and more as silent reinforcement. The room had stopped pretending this was routine. Whispers no longer hid themselves behind polite distance. A young man near the queue display pretended to scroll through emails while angling his phone for a clearer view. The older gentleman who had earlier read his newspaper now leaned forward openly, elbows resting on his knees, curiosity overtaking discretion. Daniel's voice remained controlled, but its volume had subtly increased. Ms. Carter, until authorization confirmation is received from institutional leadership channels, we cannot allow further interaction with restricted account materials. Restricted account materials. The phrase sounded technical, yet its implication echoed publicly. Aaliyah sat calmly, hands resting lightly on the leather portfolio. "I have already provided the requested documentation," she said evenly. Her tone remained measured. Daniel nodded once, though the nod contained no agreement. "Documentation alone does not always guarantee legitimacy," Emily added quietly. Legitimacy. The word carried weight heavier than policy language. Officer Collins shifted slightly closer to the consultation desk, not obstructing Aaliyah's movement, but creating a subtle boundary between her and the main service counter. A boundary now visible. A boundary now observed. Daniel glanced briefly toward the security officers before continuing. "Our responsibility is to protect our clients. Protect clients." The phrasing separated categories without explicitly naming them. Aaliyah's gaze remained steady. "And you believe I am not a client?" she asked calmly. Emily's lips pressed together momentarily before responding. "We are simply ensuring compliance standards are met." Standards? Another neutral word carrying pointed implication. Officer Miller folded his hands calmly in front of him. "Ma'am, we appreciate your cooperation," he said. Cooperation. Expectation framed as courtesy. The young woman near the entrance shifted her weight, whispering quietly to her companion. "This seems unnecessary," she murmured, though not loudly enough to interrupt the unfolding authority. Daniel's eyes returned to Aaliyah. "We may need to ask you to step away from the primary banking area until verification is completed." Step away. The phrase landed more directly this time. Aaliyah did not immediately respond. Instead, she looked briefly toward the glass entrance once more, sunlight reflected against the polished marble floor in clean geometric shapes. And 21 a.m. The room waited. Expectation thickened. Emily spoke again, her voice slightly sharper. "These procedures exist to prevent unauthorized financial activity." Unauthorized financial activity. The implication had now been voiced clearly enough that even those pretending not to listen could hear it. The older gentleman shifted uncomfortably. The young professional lowered his phone slightly, uncertainty flickering across his expression. Daniel gestured lightly toward the open lobby area beyond the consultation desk. "It would be best if you waited near the seating area until verification is confirmed." Best. For whom remained unspoken. Officer Collins subtly adjusted his stance, now positioned slightly closer to Aaliyah's left side, not touching, not directing physically, yet unmistakably guiding. Aaliyah stood slowly, gracefully. No visible resistance, no raised voice, only composure. She lifted the leather portfolio calmly from the desk. Emily did not immediately return the documentation folder. Possession maintained, control reinforced. "Your materials will remain with us temporarily," Emily said. Temporarily. A word rarely comforting when authority held it. Aaliyah paused briefly. Her eyes moved from the folder to Emily, then to Daniel, then to the security officers, finally toward the observing customers, whose expressions now ranged from curiosity to discomfort. She nodded once. Calm acceptance. Officer Miller gestured gently toward the seating area near the front windows. "This way, ma'am." "Ma'am." Respectful language. Restrictive implication. As Aaliyah walked across the polished floor, the quiet murmur of observation followed her movement. A woman in a navy coat lowered her gaze. A man in a gray suit pretended to check messages. The older gentleman sighed softly. Social discomfort rarely found a voice strong enough to interrupt authority. Aaliyah reached the indicated seating area and sat calmly, placing the portfolio beside her. Her posture remained straight, her expression unchanged. Daniel and Emily remained near the consultation desk, reviewing the documentation again. The security officers positioned themselves nearby, maintaining respectful distance, yet unmistakable presence. The quiet theater of assumption continued. Emily spoke softly to Daniel. "I knew something didn't feel consistent." Daniel nodded slightly. "We cannot take risks involving financial misrepresentation." Risk. Misrepresentation. Words now shaping narrative. Officer Collins's radio emitted a faint burst of static before returning to silence. Aaliyah glanced briefly at the clock mounted near the digital cue display, 10:22 a.m. 2 minutes remained within the unseen countdown only she understood. The young woman near the entrance looked toward her companion again. "This doesn't seem right," she whispered softly. Her companion shrugged slightly. Authority often silenced doubt. Daniel approached the seating area once more. His posture remained polite, his tone carefully controlled. "Thank you for your patience," he said again. Patience repeated often enough could begin sounding like dismissal. Emily remained several steps behind him, the folder still in her hands. Possession, control. Assumption reinforced through repetition. Aaliyah met Daniel's gaze calmly. "Of course," she said. 2 simple words, delivered without tension, without defensiveness, without fear. Because she knew something Daniel did not. She knew the next few minutes would not belong to assumption. They would belong to truth. And truth rarely entered quietly. The room continued watching, waiting, certain of its judgment, unaware how quickly certainty could unravel, unaware how fragile authority could become when confronted with facts beyond its expectation, unaware that the approaching moment would not simply correct misunderstanding, it would redefine it, and when realization arrived, silence would follow. By 10:23 a.m., the quiet tension inside Hawthorne National Bank had transformed into something far more visible than hesitation. It had become exclusion. Aaliyah Carter remained seated near the front window, her posture calm, her hands resting lightly atop the leather portfolio placed beside her chair. Outside, the late morning light reflected off passing cars, sending shifting patterns of brightness across the polished marble floor. The bank's interior, designed to convey trust and stability, now carried an undercurrent of discomfort that no architectural elegance could conceal. Daniel Harper stood several feet away, speaking quietly with Emily Whitmore. Their voices remained low, but their body language communicated enough to anyone watching. Emily's arms were crossed again. Daniel's brows remained drawn. Officer Grant Miller and Officer Raymond Collins stood nearby, their presence, steady, controlled, but no longer neutral in the perception of those observing. Authority had taken shape. The older gentleman near the waiting area adjusted his glasses, openly watching now. The young professional who had earlier attempted discretion now held his phone loosely at his side, no longer pretending disinterest. The woman in the navy coat had shifted her chair slightly, positioning herself for a clearer view. No one spoke loudly, but everyone was aware. Daniel approached Aaliyah once more, the folder still in Emily's possession. "Ms. Carter," he began, maintaining the formal tone he had used throughout the exchange. "At this time, we are unable to confirm authorization through the channels available to this branch." Unable. A word that transferred responsibility elsewhere. "We therefore must ask that you temporarily conclude your visit until verification can be completed." Conclude your visit. The phrasing softened the action, but not the meaning. Aaliyah looked up calmly. "I have a scheduled appointment," she said. Daniel nodded once. Yes, however, until confirmation is obtained, we are not able to proceed. Proceed. Progress halted by assumption. Emily stepped slightly closer. We will contact you once appropriate confirmation is received, she added. Contact you. Later. Elsewhere. Removed from visibility. Officer Collins shifted his stance subtly, his presence now aligned with Daniel's request. Ma'am, Officer Miller said gently, we'll need to ask you to exit the main banking floor for now. Exit. The word landed clearly. Several customers exchanged glances. The young woman near the entrance lowered her phone completely, now her expression uncertain. The older gentleman exhaled slowly, discomfort visible in the tightening of his jaw. Aaliyah stood without argument, graceful, composed. She lifted her portfolio calmly. Emily still held the folder containing the documentation. Possession remained with the institution. Daniel offered a small gesture toward the entrance. We appreciate your cooperation, he said again. Cooperation repeated often enough could begin sounding like dismissal, framed as courtesy. Aaliyah began walking toward the glass doors. Officer Miller accompanied her at a respectful distance, ensuring the interaction maintained its appearance of professionalism rather than confrontation. Still, the symbolism remained unmistakable. A well-dressed black woman being escorted from a private banking area, watched by strangers, judged without context. The quiet murmur followed her movement. A man near the service line whispered something under his breath. Another customer shifted uncomfortably, looking away. Social discomfort rarely interrupted institutional momentum. The sunlight near the entrance brightened as the doors opened automatically. For a brief moment, the sounds of the city filtered inside distant traffic, a faint car horn, the rhythm of footsteps passing along the sidewalk. Normal life continuing beyond the tension contained within the bank walls. Officer Miller stopped just short of the exit, maintaining professional courtesy. Thank you for your understanding, he said calmly. Understanding. Expectation framed as agreement. Aaliyah stepped outside onto the smooth concrete walkway, the glass doors closing quietly behind her with a soft, mechanical seal. Inside, Daniel exhaled slowly. Emily adjusted the folder in her hands. Control remained internal. From outside, Aaliyah could still see the figures inside the lobby. Silhouettes moving behind glass. Observers returning to routine now that the disruption had been removed. But routine had not truly returned. Not yet. Aaliyah glanced at her watch at 10:24 a.m. 1 minute? Her expression remained calm, untroubled. Because moments like this did not surprise her anymore. She had encountered skepticism before, dismissal before, assumption before. She had learned that dignity often required endurance before recognition arrived. Inside the bank, Emily placed the folder on the consultation desk, her voice quieter now. I still think it was the right call, she said. Daniel nodded slightly. We followed protocol. Protocol, a word capable of concealing bias when left unexamined. Officer Collins returned to his post near the entrance's posture. Unchanged. Officer Miller exchanged a brief nod with Daniel before stepping back toward the security desk. Normal positioning resumed, but something subtle had shifted beneath the surface. Aaliyah stood just beyond the glass doors, the morning light reflecting softly against the structured lines of her blazer. Pedestrians moved past without noticing the moment that had just unfolded. 7 minutes. That was all it would take. Inside, Daniel reviewed the documents once more, his brow tightening slightly at the unfamiliar authorization codes still visible on the pages. Emily glanced toward the entrance briefly. The woman they had just escorted out remained standing calmly outside, not pacing, not calling, not protesting, waiting. That detail created the first small crack in Emily's certainty. People removed unfairly often reacted emotionally. Anger, frustration, embarrassment. But calm confidence introduced a different kind of uncertainty. Daniel placed the folder down again. Executive confirmation will clarify everything he said quietly. Clarify. The assumption remained intact, yet the tone now carried a trace of unease. Outside, Aaliyah checked the time, once more 10:25 a.m. Right on schedule. Down the street, a black luxury sedan turned the corner, unnoticed, for now. Inside the bank, employees returned to their terminals. Customers resumed conversations. The moment appeared concluded, resolved, filed away as precaution successfully executed. No one yet realized that the decision they believed protected the institution had already set something far more significant into motion. Because in exactly 1 minute, someone else would walk through those doors, and the meaning of protocol would change completely. At 10:26 a.m., the rhythm of the street outside Hawthorne National Bank shifted in a way subtle enough to go unnoticed at first. A black luxury sedan slowed as it approached the curb, directly in front of the glass entrance. Its exterior reflected the late morning sunlight in smooth, uninterrupted lines, the polished surface revealing meticulous care. The vehicle did not display excess, yet its presence suggested significance. Inside the bank, most employees had returned to their stations, quietly convincing themselves that the situation had been handled appropriately. Daniel Harper stood near the consultation desk, reviewing internal compliance notes, attempting to reassure himself that the decision aligned with institutional responsibility. Emily Whitmore reorganized the folder containing Aaliyah Carter's documents, smoothing the edges as though physical order might reinforce professional certainty. Officer Grant Miller resumed his position near the entrance posture, relaxed but attentive. Officer Raymond Collins stood several feet away, scanning the lobby with practiced routine. Routine had returned, or so it seemed. Outside the sedan came to a controlled stop. The driver exited first, moving with quiet efficiency, to open the rear passenger door. From inside the vehicle stepped Jonathan Reeves. His presence did not require announcement. Those familiar with financial leadership publications might have recognized his composed expression, the steady gaze of someone accustomed to high-stakes decisions. Jonathan Reeves rarely visited individual retail branches personally. His schedule typically existed at levels far removed from daily customer interactions. Yet here he was, in person, without prior notice. Inside the bank, Officer Miller's attention shifted first. Subtle training often detected deviation before others noticed. He straightened slightly. Jonathan Reeves adjusted the cuff of his tailored charcoal overcoat before walking toward the entrance with measured pace. Purposeful, unhurried, certain. The glass doors opened automatically. A faint hush followed. Daniel looked up instinctively, noticing the unfamiliar figure entering the lobby. Recognition arrived slowly at first, then completely. His posture stiffened. Emily glanced toward the entrance as well, curiosity shifting quickly into confusion as she observed Daniel's reaction. Jonathan Reeves stepped inside, scanning the interior with quiet focus. His gaze moved across the reception area, past the consultation desk, toward the seating area near the front windows, then toward the glass doors behind him, where Aaliyah Carter still stood outside, waiting calmly. Jonathan's expression changed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. His jaw tightened, his pace quickened. Daniel stepped forward, immediately adjusting his tie as he approached. "Mr. Reeves," he said, surprise visible in the slight tension of his voice. "We were not informed of your visit today." Jonathan's eyes remained fixed beyond Daniel's shoulder. Clearly he replied calmly. One word, controlled, heavy. Emily exchanged a brief glance with Daniel, uncertainty beginning to form beneath her professional composure. Jonathan continued, walking past them toward the entrance. Officer Miller stepped aside respectfully. The glass doors opened again. Jonathan stepped outside. Aaliyah remained standing in the same composed posture she had maintained since leaving the building. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Jonathan Reeves extended his hand. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice carrying unmistakable respect. "I sincerely apologize for the delay." Delay. Not misunderstanding, not confusion. Delay. Inside the bank, Daniel felt the first sharp shift of unease. Emily's grip tightened slightly on the folder still in her hands. Jonathan continued. "I was informed that your arrival time was 10:15 a.m. Traffic caused a slight disruption." Aaliyah accepted the handshake calmly. "No inconvenience," she said evenly. Jonathan nodded once, relief briefly visible in the softening of his expression. "Thank you for your patience. Patience again. But now spoken differently. Now spoken with recognition." Jonathan gestured politely toward the entrance. "Please," he said, "let's continue inside." As they walked back toward the glass doors together, the difference in atmosphere became immediately visible. Authority had changed direction. Inside the lobby, Daniel's posture straightened instinctively. Emily stepped forward quickly, her expression attempting to reorganize itself into composed professionalism. Jonathan entered first, holding the door slightly as Aaliyah followed. Several customers who had earlier observed quietly now openly watched. Confusion moved through the room. Expectation reversed. Jonathan turned toward Daniel calmly. "I understand Ms. Carter has been waiting," he said. Daniel swallowed once before responding. "We were in the process of verification." Jonathan raised one hand slightly. Not aggressively. Simply enough to pause the explanation. "That will not be necessary," he said. Silence followed. Complete. Emily's eyes moved quickly between Jonathan and Aaliyah, between authority and assumption. Jonathan continued. "Ms. Carter is the principal strategic partner responsible for the capital stabilization instrument executed in Q3 3 years ago." The words landed slowly, but heavily. Daniel's expression changed. Understanding arrived all at once. Color drained slightly from his face. The number surfaced immediately in his mind. $480 million. The agreement that had prevented branch closures. The agreement discussed repeatedly during executive briefings. Confidential. Restricted visibility. Not accessible within retail clearance tiers. Emily's fingers tightened around the folder. Her earlier certainty dissolved into realization. Jonathan turned slightly toward Aaliyah. "The board has been looking forward to today's review," he said respectfully. "Board." The word echoed loudly within Daniel's thoughts. Emily's breath caught slightly. Several customers exchanged confused glances. The older gentleman lowered his gaze. The young professional slowly lowered his phone completely. Jonathan's voice remained calm. "We appreciate your continued confidence in the institution." Confidence. A word now carrying weight far beyond transaction scale. Daniel attempted to speak. "I was not aware." Jonathan looked toward him briefly. "I understand," he said. The phrase sounded neutral, but carried unmistakable disappointment. Emily's earlier posture of certainty had vanished completely now. The folder in her hands suddenly felt heavier. Jonathan gestured politely toward the private meeting offices. "Shall we proceed?" Aaliyah nodded once. Calm, unchanged, as though the past 7 minutes had simply been confirmation of something she already understood about the world. Daniel stepped aside. Emily followed silently. Officer Miller returned to his position, his expression now reflecting quiet comprehension of the shift that had occurred. The room remained silent, watching, processing. realizing. Moments earlier, authority had escorted her out. Now authority waited for her to proceed. And the weight of that reversal had only just begun settling over everyone who had witnessed it. The silence inside Hawthorne National Bank did not disappear immediately. It thickened. Every movement now seemed amplified by the weight of realization slowly unfolding across the room. Jonathan Reeves walked beside Aaliyah Carter with the composed urgency of someone who understood that a mistake had already been made, and that the consequences of that mistake could extend far beyond embarrassment. Daniel Harper followed several steps behind his thoughts, racing through fragmented memories of executive briefings, quarterly risk summaries, and restricted memoranda that referenced a confidential institutional partner whose capital intervention had stabilized Hawthorne National Bank during one of its most vulnerable financial periods. The numbers surfaced first. $480 million, structured across layered allocation instruments designed to prevent liquidity disruption during a volatile market cycle. He remembered the internal phrase used at executive level: strategic preservation event. He had never expected to meet the individual responsible. Emily Whitmore walked quietly behind them, still holding the folder she had earlier treated as procedural documentation. Now the pages inside seemed less like paperwork and more like evidence of her own misjudgment. Jonathan gestured toward the private executive consultation room located behind the glass-partitioned offices. "This space has been prepared for your review," he said respectfully. Prepared. The word echoed differently now. Aaliyah entered first, her composure unchanged. The room itself reflected understated authority: a long walnut conference table, soft recessed lighting, a wall-mounted digital display, and a discreet carafe of water positioned beside 3 crystal glasses. Jonathan waited until the door closed before speaking again. "I was informed only moments ago that there had been confusion regarding your arrival," he said carefully. Confusion. A word chosen for diplomacy, but insufficient to describe what had occurred. Aaliyah placed her portfolio on the table and opened it calmly. "There was no confusion," she said evenly. Jonathan's expression tightened slightly. Daniel felt the words settle heavily in the air. Emily lowered her gaze briefly. Jonathan nodded once. "I understand," he replied quietly. He turned toward Daniel. "Ms. Carter is not only an institutional partner," he said, his voice calm, but precise. "She is the controlling strategic authority behind Carter Global Holdings' capital preservation structure." Daniel felt a subtle tightening in his chest. Controlling authority. The words confirmed what the documentation had already suggested, but hearing them spoken aloud removed any remaining ambiguity. Emily's fingers tightened slightly around the folder she still carried. Jonathan continued. 3 years ago, when commercial real estate volatility placed regional liquidity stability at risk, Carter Global Holdings provided the allocation mechanism that allowed Hawthorne National Bank to maintain operational continuity without forced contraction. Operational continuity, without forced contraction. Daniel understood exactly what that meant. Branch closures avoided, layoffs prevented, institutional credibility preserved. The stability of hundreds of employees quietly protected. He himself had remained employed because of that decision. Jonathan's voice remained steady. "The allocation structure remains active. Active, present, influential." Aaliyah reviewed the documents inside her portfolio briefly before speaking. "The review today concerns Phase 2 expansion positioning tied to infrastructure-linked credit channels," she said calmly. Her tone carried no arrogance, no triumph, only professional clarity. Emily finally spoke, her voice quieter than before. "We were not aware of the connection at branch level." Jonathan looked at her calmly. "The confidentiality tier associated with Ms. Carter's partnership does not appear within retail authorization systems." Confidentiality tier. A structural barrier that had contributed to misjudgment. Daniel exhaled slowly, understanding now fully formed. The absence of information had allowed assumption to fill the space. Assumption had guided behavior. Behavior had created consequence. Jonathan turned toward Aaliyah again. "I regret the experience you encountered upon arrival," he said sincerely. "Regret. Not apology alone. Recognition." Aaliyah met his gaze evenly. "Experiences like this are rarely isolated," she said calmly. The statement contained no accusation, only truth. Daniel felt the words land with quiet force. Jonathan nodded once. "That is precisely why we must address this appropriately. Address. Not dismiss. Not overlook. Address." He turned toward Daniel. "I will need a full account of the interaction sequence." Daniel straightened instinctively. Yes, of course. Professional instinct returned, but now accompanied by unease. Emily placed the folder carefully on the table in front of Aaliyah. "I apologize for the misunderstanding," she said quietly. Misunderstanding, a softer word than misjudgment, but still insufficient. Aaliyah accepted the folder calmly. "Documentation rarely speaks loudly enough to overcome perception," she said. Jonathan absorbed the statement without interruption, because he understood its meaning fully. Institutional trust depended not only on capital, but on conduct. Outside the executive consultation room, the quiet tension remained visible. Customers whispered softly. Employees pretended to focus on screens while listening for fragments of explanation. The older gentleman folded his newspaper completely now. Observation had transformed into reflection. Inside the room, Jonathan activated the wall display, projecting the summary framework associated with the infrastructure allocation expansion proposal. "Today's review remains a priority," he said respectfully. Priority, a word now carrying clarity. Aaliyah nodded once. "The timeline remains unchanged," she replied. "Unchanged, despite everything." Jonathan glanced briefly toward Daniel. Responsibility now clearly defined. Daniel spoke carefully. "We appreciate the continued partnership." Partnership, a word that now felt heavier, more fragile. Emily remained silent. Learning often required discomfort. Jonathan poured water into 3 glasses, offering one to Aaliyah first. Respect now visibly expressed. The balance inside the room had shifted completely. Authority had revealed its true structure. Assumption had revealed its cost. And realization had begun its work quietly. Because the impact of the past 7 minutes would not end inside this room. Its consequences would move outward, through policy, through training, through memory, through reputation. Jonathan closed the digital presentation briefly. "Before we proceed," he said calmly, "there is something we must address first." Daniel felt the weight of those words immediately. Because acknowledgement would not be optional. Accountability rarely waited quietly once truth became visible. And what came next would define more than a single interaction. It would define culture. The room remained still after Jonathan Reeves spoke the word accountability. It did not echo loudly, yet its presence filled the executive consultation room with unmistakable gravity. The digital display on the wall had dimmed slightly. The presentation paused, as if even the technology understood that the next moments required attention beyond numbers. Daniel Harper stood with controlled posture. But the confidence that had guided his earlier decisions had dissolved into something far more fragile. Uncertainty. Emily Whitmore remained silent beside the conference table, her earlier certainty replaced by the quiet realization that the situation she believed she had contained had in fact exposed something far more consequential. Jonathan folded his hands calmly. Ms. Carter's partnership is not symbolic, he said. His tone remained composed, but deliberate. The capital structure she authorized 3 years ago prevented Hawthorne National Bank from entering regulatory intervention status. Regulatory intervention. Daniel felt the phrase settle heavily in his chest. Intervention would have meant external oversight, loss of institutional autonomy, public disclosure of instability, loss of investor confidence, loss of clients, loss of reputation, possibly loss of employment for hundreds of people across multiple branches, including this one. Jonathan continued. At the time, market volatility caused a significant liquidity compression across mid-tier regional institutions. His eyes briefly moved toward Daniel. You may recall the internal briefings describing that period. Daniel nodded slowly. He remembered the language used. Strategic preservation event. Capital resilience positioning. He had studied the summaries carefully. But those briefings never included a photograph, never included a name widely circulated at retail level. Confidential partner. Institutional authority. Shielded identity. Aaliyah Carter. Jonathan gestured toward the portfolio resting open on the table. The stabilization instrument was structured through Carter Global Holdings under Ms. Carter's direct authorization. Direct authorization, not representation, not participation. Control. Emily felt the weight of the distinction immediately. Jonathan continued calmly. The board recognized the allocation as one of the most decisive financial interventions in the institution's recent history. Decisive? Not helpful? Not supportive? Decisive. Daniel's throat tightened slightly. Jonathan turned toward Aaliyah respectfully. Your decision at that time preserved operational continuity across 47 branch locations. 47. The number landed clearly. Daniel's branch included, Emily's position included, Officer Miller's security contract included. The quiet ripple of consequence expanded further with each spoken detail. Jonathan continued. The capital allocation also enabled the infrastructure credit expansion initiative currently under review today. The present meeting. Not routine. Strategic. Influential. Aaliyah spoke calmly. The stability of regional financial access networks depends on consistent institutional reliability. Her tone remained professional. Measured, never accusatory. Jonathan nodded once. That reliability extends beyond balance sheets. The statement lingered deliberately. Daniel understood. Financial trust and human trust rarely functioned separately. Jonathan turned slightly toward Emily. Frontline client interaction represents the institution's values more visibly than executive policy statements. Values. The word pressed gently, but firmly. Emily lowered her gaze briefly. I understand, she said quietly. Jonathan continued. The allocation structure currently in place includes discretionary expansion authority, contingent upon institutional alignment with partnership principles. Discretionary expansion authority. The phrase carried enormous weight. Future capital, future growth, future stability. All dependent on alignment. Daniel felt the implication fully. The interaction that had unfolded minutes earlier now existed within a much larger context. Not only personal misjudgment, institutional risk. Jonathan's voice remained calm. Ms. Carter retains full discretion regarding continuation of the second phase allocation sequence. Full discretion. Authority clearly defined. Emily's earlier confidence now felt distant, replaced by awareness. Daniel spoke carefully. We were not aware that today's appointment involved executive-level review. Jonathan responded evenly. Confidentiality tiers exist to protect both the institution and the partner. protect, a word that now revealed complexity rather than justification. Aaliyah closed the portfolio slowly. "I did not request special treatment," she said. Her voice remained steady. "I expected standard professionalism." Standard. A simple word, yet powerful. Jonathan inclined his head slightly. "That expectation is reasonable." Reasonable. Undeniable. Daniel exhaled quietly. Recognition often arrived accompanied by discomfort. Jonathan continued, "The board views today's review as critical to regional expansion positioning projected over the next 6 fiscal cycles. 6 fiscal cycles. Years of influence, years of opportunity, years of growth, or contraction, depending on alignment." Emily felt her earlier assumptions unravel fully now. The quiet judgments, the coded language, the request for additional verification, the involvement of security, each decision now visible within a broader frame. Jonathan turned toward Aaliyah again. "We value the partnership you have extended. Value, not symbolic, real, material, significant." Aaliyah met his gaze calmly. "My priority has always been structural reliability," she said. "Reliability, consistency, integrity." Words now echoing differently than earlier references to compliance standards. Jonathan allowed a brief pause, then spoke again. "I trust we can continue today's review productively." Trust. A word that could not be requested, only earned. Daniel nodded once. "We will ensure appropriate procedural adjustments moving forward." Adjustments. An acknowledgement without defensiveness. Emily spoke quietly. "I appreciate the opportunity to correct the situation." Correct, not erase. Correct. Jonathan studied her expression briefly, then nodded once. Learning moments strengthen institutions when addressed honestly. Strengthen, not weaken, if recognized properly. Outside the consultation room, the quiet hum of daily operations continued. Customers resumed transactions. Employees returned to terminals. But the story unfolding behind the glass walls would not remain confined there. Its lessons would move outward, into policy, into training, into memory. Jonathan activated the display once more. Numbers appeared, graphs formed, projections aligned, yet the most significant shift had already occurred. Not within financial models, within understanding. Because the true twist was not simply that Aaliyah held influence, it was that influence had never needed to announce itself. Authority rarely raised its voice. It waited, observed, and revealed itself when assumption became visible. Daniel sat slowly. Emily took her seat beside him. Jonathan remained standing momentarily. Aaliyah opened the portfolio again. Calm, focused, unchanged. Because the truth had never required urgency, only timing, and now timing had done its work. The executive consultation room no longer felt like a space for routine financial review. It had become a place where reality corrected perception. Jonathan Reeves remained standing for a moment after the digital presentation appeared on the wall displayed the clean lines of financial projections reflecting faintly across the polished walnut table. The quiet hum of the building's climate system filled the silence that followed a neutral sound, contrasting the internal discomfort now moving through Daniel Harper's thoughts. Numbers had never intimidated Daniel. Uncertainty had. And uncertainty had now taken a very specific shape. Aaliyah Carter reviewed the projected framework with focused calm, her attention moving across the financial modeling structure as if the emotional weight of the last 20 minutes had not touched her concentration at all. Her composure did not signal indifference. It signaled experience. Jonathan spoke carefully. The expansion sequence under review today represents a projected stabilization margin across 5 metropolitan regions. His tone remained professional, but attentive. Daniel followed the figures displayed on the screen, recognizing familiar terminology from internal planning briefings. Liquidity reinforcement, regional credit distribution, infrastructure resilience positioning, concepts previously discussed in theoretical planning sessions, now sitting directly in front of the individual whose authorization determined whether those models would become reality. Emily remained silent beside him, absorbing the scale of what had been nearly disrupted by assumption alone. Jonathan continued. The projected allocation schedule remains contingent upon confidence in institutional consistency. Confidence. The word returned. Not abstract, not symbolic. Operational. Aaliyah nodded slightly. The stability of capital partnerships depends on predictability across all operational touchpoints, she said calmly. Operational touchpoints. Daniel understood immediately. Policy meant little if behavior contradicted it. Trust required continuity from executive leadership down to frontline interaction. Jonathan leaned slightly forward, resting his hands lightly on the table. The board's priority remains long-term institutional credibility, he said. Credibility, a concept fragile when tested publicly. Emily finally spoke, her voice quieter than earlier, stripped of the defensive certainty that had shaped her tone before. I recognize that our handling of the initial interaction did not reflect that standard. The acknowledgement remained simple, unembellished, honest. Jonathan regarded her calmly. Recognition represents the first step toward correction. Correction. Not punishment. Not avoidance. Correction. Daniel spoke next. Our branch will fully cooperate with any internal review deemed appropriate. Internal review. The phrase carried procedural weight, but also ethical implication. Jonathan nodded once. That will be necessary. Necessary. The word landed without hostility, only inevitability. Aaliyah closed the financial projection briefly, her attention shifting from numbers to people. My objective has always been structural reliability, she said. Her voice remained calm, measured, professional. When institutions demonstrate consistency, capital remains patient. Patient. An echo of the earlier word repeated throughout the morning. Patience. Jonathan inclined his head slightly. That consistency must be visible at every level. Every level. No exceptions. Daniel understood the meaning fully now. Reputation formed through repetition. Every interaction contributed. Every assumption accumulated. Emily rested her hands lightly on the table. I allowed perception to influence procedure, she admitted quietly. The admission did not excuse the action, but it acknowledged the cause. Jonathan remained composed. Awareness allows progress. Progress required recognition of failure, not denial of it. Outside the glass walls, the bank's operations had resumed their usual rhythm, yet subtle awareness remained among those who had witnessed the earlier exchange. The older gentleman had remained longer than necessary, curiosity transformed into reflection. The young professional who had earlier held his phone now spoke quietly with a teller, his tone noticeably subdued. Moments like these rarely remained isolated. They traveled, through conversation, through memory, through culture. Jonathan returned his attention to the digital display. The expansion proposal includes projected job creation across regional service divisions, he said. Job creation, opportunity, growth. The implications extended beyond numbers. Aaliyah reviewed the timeline structure displayed on the screen. The allocation schedule remains viable, she said. Viable, despite everything. Jonathan exhaled quietly, relief visible in the subtle release of tension in his shoulders. We appreciate your continued confidence. Confidence maintained, but not guaranteed. Daniel remained attentive. Responsibility now clearly understood. Emily remained focused, learning fully engaged. Jonathan turned toward both of them. Moments like today reveal the difference between written values and practiced values. Written values, mission statements, policy manuals, practiced values, human behavior. Aaliyah met his gaze briefly. Alignment between the two determines institutional longevity, she said. Longevity, not quarterly, not temporary, enduring. Jonathan nodded. Agreed. The word carried commitment, not convenience. He adjusted the presentation timeline slightly. Today's review will continue as scheduled. Continue. Forward movement, opportunity preserved, yet changed, because awareness had entered the room. Daniel understood that the next steps would extend beyond financial documentation. Training protocols, bias awareness frameworks, client interaction standards. Institutional learning rarely occurred without discomfort. Emily spoke once more. I intend to ensure improvement moving forward. Improve. The simplest promise. The most difficult to demonstrate. Aaliyah acknowledged the statement with a small nod. Jonathan allowed a brief pause before continuing the presentation. Projected charts reappeared. Forecast structures aligned. Strategic models resumed their central place in the conversation. Yet beneath the numbers, something more significant had already shifted. Understanding. Because the truth revealed that mourning extended beyond financial authority. It revealed the quiet cost of assumption and the lasting value of dignity maintained without compromise. Jonathan closed the current slide. We are aligned to proceed, he said. Aligned, a word now carrying deeper meaning. The consequences of the previous 20 minutes would not disappear. They would evolve into policy, into awareness, into culture. Because the most powerful institutions did not avoid mistakes. They learned from them visibly. And what Hawthorne National Bank chose to do next would define far more than a single partnership. It would define trust itself. By early afternoon, the atmosphere inside Hawthorne National Bank had shifted in a way no employee could ignore. The executive consultation room door opened at 12:08 p.m., and although the financial review had concluded with structured professionalism, the emotional weight of the morning had not disappeared. If anything, it had clarified the urgency of what needed to change. Jonathan Reeves stepped out first, his expression composed but firm. The quiet authority of executive leadership now directed not toward financial projections, but toward institutional accountability. Daniel Harper followed posture disciplined, yet noticeably more restrained than earlier that morning. The confidence that once guided his procedural certainty had evolved into reflective caution. Emily Whitmore walked beside him, holding a notepad now filled with handwritten observations she had begun recording during the latter portion of the review. Aaliyah Carter exited last. Her composure remained unchanged, graceful, steady, unshaken. As they entered the main lobby, subtle shifts in attention occurred immediately. Several employees glanced up from their screens. A few customers who had remained in the building longer than necessary now watched openly, aware that the morning's incident had not simply disappeared behind closed doors. Moments of visible tension rarely dissolved quietly. Jonathan turned slightly toward Daniel. I would like to meet with your branch leadership team immediately, he said calmly. Immediately. Not later, not postponed. Daniel nodded without hesitation. I will assemble the team now. His voice carried the tone of someone aware that delay would only deepen the consequences already forming. Emily walked toward the internal communication desk and began sending discreet messages requesting the presence of senior staff members, compliance officers, and customer relations supervisors. Within minutes, a small group gathered inside the conference room adjacent to the main operations area. The glass walls allowed partial visibility from the lobby. Transparency had become unavoidable. Jonathan remained standing at the head of the table. Daniel and Emily sat opposite him, joined by two senior associates, the compliance coordinator and the regional client experience supervisor. Aaliyah did not initially enter the room. She remained near the reception area, reviewing several documents inside her portfolio while waiting calmly. Her presence alone influenced the atmosphere. Jonathan began without raising his voice. This morning revealed a gap between institutional policy and operational execution. Gap. A word precise enough to avoid accusation, yet impossible to ignore. The compliance coordinator opened a digital notebook prepared to document every word. Jonathan continued. Hawthorne National Bank has built its reputation on principles of financial integrity, reliability, and equitable client engagement. Equitable. The word carried particular weight now. Those principles must be visible at every level of interaction. Every level. Front desk, management, security. No exceptions. Daniel listened attentively. We followed standard verification protocol, he said carefully. Jonathan acknowledged the statement with a small nod. Protocol must function in alignment with professional judgment. Alignment. Not blind adherence, not assumption. Alignment. Emily spoke quietly. In retrospect, the interaction escalated too quickly. Escalated. A word that softened the underlying reality. Jonathan did not challenge the phrasing. Instead, he clarified the impact. Escalation without balanced assessment creates reputational risk. Reputational risk. A phrase every financial professional understood immediately. Trust lost faster than capital. The regional client experience supervisor leaned forward slightly. Will there be a formal review? She asked. Jonathan's answer was immediate. Yes. Simple. Clear. Expected. Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle fully. What will the review involve? He asked. Jonathan responded calmly. Evaluation of procedural interpretation, client interaction conduct, and escalation criteria, application, structured language, measured response, but unmistakable implication. Learning would be required, not optional. Emily continued writing notes. Her earlier certainty had been replaced by focused accountability. Jonathan paused briefly, then added one final clarification. This is not about individual blame. Relief flickered briefly across the room, but Jonathan continued. This is about institutional alignment. Alignment again. Consistency between principle and behavior. Outside the conference room, Aaliyah remained composed. Her attention focused on reviewing financial timeline adjustments. She did not demand involvement in the internal discussion. She did not request apology repetition. She allowed the institution to demonstrate its own understanding. Moments of dignity rarely required performance. They required recognition. After 40 minutes, the internal meeting concluded with clear next steps. Mandatory bias awareness training, client interaction protocol review, revised escalation guidance, enhanced communication channels between executive partnership offices and branch-level teams, structural improvement. Jonathan stepped out of the conference room and approached Aaliyah once more. The institution will address this appropriately, he said respectfully. Appropriately. Not superficially, not symbolically, meaningfully. Aaliyah nodded once. My priority remains structural consistency, she replied. Consistency. Predictability. Trust. Daniel approached carefully. I appreciate your patience today, he said. Patience once again, but now accompanied by understanding. Emily spoke quietly. I regret the assumptions I allowed to influence my decisions. The statement was simple, direct, unembellished. Aaliyah met her gaze calmly. Professional environments improve when awareness becomes action, she said. Jonathan nodded slightly. Action will follow. Follow, not remain theoretical. As Aaliyah prepared to leave the branch later that afternoon, the atmosphere within Hawthorne National Bank felt markedly different from the morning. Employees spoke more carefully. Managers listened more attentively. The memory of the morning interaction had already begun shaping behavior, because some lessons arrived not through policy manuals, but through lived experience. Daniel stood near the entrance as Aaliyah exited, offering a respectful nod. Emily did the same. The security officers maintained professional posture, their expressions neutral, but noticeably more thoughtful. Outside, the late afternoon light reflected warmly across the glass facade. The same entrance. A different understanding. Because accountability had begun its work. And the consequences of recognition often extended far beyond a single moment. They extended into culture, and culture defined everything. 3 weeks after the incident, the atmosphere inside Hawthorne National Bank felt noticeably different. Change rarely announced itself loudly. It revealed itself through subtle adjustments in tone, posture, and awareness. At the downtown Chicago branch, employees now greeted each client with a level of attentiveness that extended beyond routine courtesy. Conversations carried more intention. Questions were asked with clarity rather than assumption. The small details of human interaction, eye contact, patience listening, had become visible priorities rather than optional gestures. Institutional culture, once invisible, had become a conscious practice. The internal review initiated by Jonathan Reeves had moved quickly but thoroughly. Compliance officers, behavioral consultants, and client experience analysts conducted structured evaluations of communication patterns, escalation procedures, and unconscious bias indicators within frontline service environments. The findings did not focus solely on individuals. They examined systems, training structures, decision-making frameworks, because the lesson of that morning had revealed something deeper than one misjudgment. It had revealed how easily perception could influence process when awareness was not actively maintained. Daniel Harper participated fully in the review process. For the first time in his career, he attended a leadership workshop that did not focus on regulatory frameworks or financial risk models, but on perception dynamics and cognitive bias recognition. The material challenged assumptions he had not previously examined. He listened more than he spoke. Reflection replaced certainty. Emily Whitmore also participated in the training sessions. Her earlier confidence in procedural correctness had evolved into curiosity about the subtle ways implicit expectations influenced interpretation of client behavior. One exercise asked participants to review identical financial profiles presented with different visual identifiers. The variations in initial judgment surprised many, including Emily. Awareness rarely felt comfortable at first, but discomfort often marked the beginning of growth. Hawthorne National Bank implemented several structural adjustments following the review. Client verification protocols were revised to ensure consistency without unnecessary escalation triggers. Internal communication systems were enhanced to allow faster confirmation of institutional partnerships across clearance tiers. Frontline employees received updated guidance emphasizing neutral inquiry language and balanced interpretation of incomplete information. More importantly, leadership introduced ongoing professional development modules focused on equitable engagement principles, not as public relations gestures, as operational requirements. Jonathan Reeves addressed senior management during a regional leadership conference held 2 weeks after the incident. He did not mention names. He did not reference the specific morning directly. Instead, he spoke about institutional credibility. Financial strength attracts opportunity, he said, but institutional character sustains it. The phrase circulated internally afterward, repeated in internal memos, referenced in training sessions. Culture often evolved through repetition of simple truths. Meanwhile, Carter Global Holdings confirmed continuation of the second phase allocation program. The Infrastructure Credit Expansion Initiative moved forward, providing funding pathways for transportation, modernization, small business development programs, and community financial accessibility projects across multiple metropolitan regions. Opportunity continued because trust had been repaired through visible action, not simply promised. Daniel noticed small differences in daily interaction patterns within the branch. Employees paused more often before drawing conclusions. Questions were phrased with greater precision. Assumptions were challenged internally before becoming external actions. Professional humility had quietly entered the environment. Emily adjusted her approach consciously. Where she once relied on instinct to guide verification intensity, she now relied on structured inquiry frameworks designed to ensure neutrality. Her tone softened. Her listening deepened. Confidence remained. But certainty no longer replaced curiosity. Officer Grant Miller and Officer Raymond Collins also participated in updated client interaction alignment briefings, emphasizing situational awareness balanced with respect for professional dignity. Security presence remained important, but its symbolism was better understood. Authority communicated not only through action, but through restraint. 3 weeks after the incident, Aaliyah Carter returned briefly to the branch for a scheduled progress review. This time the welcome she received reflected not recognition of wealth, but recognition of professionalism. Emily greeted her personally. "Good morning, Ms. Carter." Her tone carried calm sincerity. Daniel met her near the consultation area. "Thank you for your continued partnership." Respect expressed without hesitation, without uncertainty. The meeting proceeded efficiently. Documents reviewed, timelines confirmed, commitments reaffirmed. No tension lingered, no assumptions interfered. The difference felt noticeable, not dramatic, but real. Before leaving, Aaliyah paused briefly near the reception area. Her gaze moved across the space where the earlier interaction had unfolded. Memory remained, but not bitterness. Moments like that rarely defined outcomes permanently. They defined opportunities. Jonathan Reeves later summarized the transformation during an executive briefing. "Trust grows strongest when tested," he said. Tested, not avoided. The institution had chosen response over denial, learning over defensiveness, alignment over convenience. Because culture did not exist in mission statements alone. It lived within daily choices, and daily choices determined reputation. Hawthorne National Bank continued moving forward. Stronger, more aware, more deliberate. The incident that once threatened embarrassment had become a catalyst for clarity, and clarity often became the foundation for lasting progress. Because justice rarely appeared as punishment alone. Often justice appeared as change. Change sustained through action. And action sustained through understanding. 6 months later, the story of that morning inside Hawthorne National Bank had quietly transformed into something larger than a single uncomfortable interaction. It had become a reference point, not publicly sensationalized, not reduced to headlines, but remembered internally as a moment when assumption collided with reality, and reality required change. Institutional memory often formed through moments of discomfort rather than celebration. Within Hawthorne National Bank, new employees now encountered case studies emphasizing the importance of balanced judgment in client interactions. Training facilitators presented scenarios encouraging staff to recognize how quickly perception could shape behavior when awareness remained passive. The lesson was simple. Professional dignity must remain consistent regardless of expectation. Emily Whitmore now trained new hires during orientation workshops. She did not present herself as an example of failure, but as an example of learning. Growth rarely emerged from perfection. It emerged from recognition. During one session, a trainee asked how she had adjusted her approach after the incident. Emily answered honestly, "I stopped assuming that confidence must look familiar in order to be real." The room had remained quiet, because the statement resonated beyond banking environments. Daniel Harper, now serving as Regional Oversight Liaison for Client Interaction Alignment Initiatives, emphasized an operational principle he once overlooked. Verification protects institutions, he explained. But respect protects relationships, both necessary, neither sufficient alone. Jonathan Reeves continued reinforcing similar ideas in executive briefings across multiple regional divisions. "The strongest institutions are those willing to examine themselves," he said during one leadership forum. Examine, reflect, improve. Words often repeated, but meaningful only when practiced. Meanwhile, Carter Global Holdings' Infrastructure Expansion Initiative had begun producing measurable impact across 5 metropolitan regions. Transportation development financing supported modernization of public transit corridors. Community business funding programs enabled small enterprise growth in underserved districts. Regional employment opportunities increased as project implementation accelerated. Capital influence extended beyond financial returns. It shaped communities, created access, expanded opportunity. Aaliyah Carter continued maintaining her preference for discretion over recognition. Her professional philosophy remained unchanged. Influence did not require visibility. Impact did not require applause. Her priority remained structural reliability, ensuring that financial institutions capable of supporting long-term community development maintained operational consistency aligned with ethical practice. The morning at Hawthorne National Bank had not altered her purpose. It had reinforced it. One evening, while reviewing quarterly allocation reports inside her office overlooking the Chicago skyline, Aaliyah paused briefly at a section referencing client engagement alignment performance metrics. The branch that once doubted her now demonstrated some of the highest improvement scores in equitable interaction assessment categories. Improvement rarely required perfection. Only intention sustained over time. Later that month, Hawthorne National Bank received recognition from an independent financial ethics consortium for measurable progress in institutional trust development practices. The award did not reference the morning incident directly, but its influence remained present. Jonathan Reeves shared the recognition with all regional teams through an internal communication message. "Trust," he wrote, "is not a static achievement. It is a continuous practice. Practice, daily, consistent, intentional." At the downtown Chicago branch, small details continued reflecting change. Employees listened more carefully before responding. Managers encouraged thoughtful interpretation rather than immediate escalation. Security presence remained professional, but less symbolically intimidating. Questions were framed with clarity rather than suspicion. Respect had become visible, not because policy demanded it, because understanding supported it. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered across the familiar marble floors of the branch lobby, Emily greeted a client whose appearance differed from what she once might have considered typical for high-value financial consultation. Her tone remained steady, neutral, professional, welcoming. No hesitation interrupted her process. No assumption shaped her approach. The interaction proceeded smoothly, unremarkably, which in this case represented meaningful progress, because fairness often appeared ordinary when practiced consistently. Months after the incident, Daniel summarized the lesson during a regional leadership review. Institutions are tested most clearly when expectation meets difference, he said. Difference, not deficiency. Difference. The distinction mattered. Jonathan Reeves later repeated a similar idea during an executive strategy forum. Financial capital can stabilize organizations, he said, but ethical capital sustains them. Ethical capital. Trust. Consistency. Respect. Intangible. Yet invaluable. As for Aaliyah Carter, she continued her work as she always had, quietly shaping financial structures capable of producing stability beyond immediate visibility. She did not seek acknowledgement for that morning. She did not revisit the moment publicly. She allowed its impact to exist where it mattered most, within behavior, within culture, within understanding, because dignity never depended on recognition. It depended on consistency of self. The lesson of that morning extended far beyond one institution. It spoke to a broader truth. Respect should never require proof of worth. Value should never depend on perception. And justice, when genuine, rarely arrives loudly. It arrives through change sustained over time,